Thank you, Charles, and thank you, everybody, for being here today. Is everyone hearing me okay? Because that's usually a problem I don't get. I never hear people saying, Paul, I can't hear you. So I'd like to welcome everybody out to the History Museum today. We're going to be talking about St. Louis's role in the Doolittle Raid. Now, I'm assuming if you're here, you're a history fan. Pretty much everybody? All right. And I'm also going to make the assumption that you know a little bit about World War II. Little bit, that's okay. A little bit's enough. And I'm going to assume that you've heard of the Doolittle Raid, maybe. If not, know a whole lot about it. So that's what we're going to be talking about today is the Doolittle Raid and St. Louis's role. So let's talk a little bit about the Doolittle Raid. April 18th, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle led 80 Army Air Force's men in a 16-plane mission to bomb factories in Japan. The mission was intended to avenge the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was outraged about the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and he wanted to hit back as quickly as possible. The problem was the U.S. really didn't have a way to hit back. We didn't have any large bombers capable of flying to Japan to bomb. We didn't have any bases close enough to Japan to bomb. So it took some ingenuity. It took a very smart Navy man to figure out that you could fly twin-engined Army Air Force bombers off of a U.S. aircraft carrier. In this case, the USS Hornet. Nobody ever tried this before. I don't think anyone had ever thought of it before. But they pulled it off. And that's the amazing thing. That's the story that we're going to be talking about today. 15 of the bombers crashed either in China or very close to it. One landed in the Soviet Union, which is a great story that I wish I had another hour to tell, but can't tell this one today. American morale soared after the bombing because we were still in a state of shock after Pearl Harbor. So U.S. was feeling great. The Japanese were very angry, and they waged a campaign against Chinese civilians that resulted in 250,000 Chinese civilians. So that's something that I always want to remind people when we talk about the heroism of the Doolittle Raid, that people suffered as well. So let's get to our cast of characters today. First character is the most obvious, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle. My name's Doolittle. If you men have any idea that this isn't the most dangerous thing you've ever been on, don't even start this training period. Imagine sitting down with a bunch of guys that you don't really know, 80 other flyers. You see this living legend walk up in front of you and say these words. You're thinking, wow, I have no idea what we're going to do, but I trust this man, I respect this man, and I'm going to follow him wherever he takes us. So you notice this is Jimmy Doolittle with the crew of Bomber 1. You notice that Jimmy has a different patch on his jacket. Everybody else has 34th Bombardment Squadron. Jimmy has Wright Field on his chest. The reason why is Jimmy wasn't attached to a squadron at that time. He was on the staff of General of the Army Air Forces Hap Arnold. So he didn't have a squadron. So he took Wright Field, which is now Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where the Museum of the U.S. Air Force is. Fantastic museum if you haven't been to it. But that's the patch that he wore for the mission. A little bit about Colonel Doolittle. He was born December 14th, 1896 in Alameda, California. He served from 1917 to 1959, which means he served in the U.S. Army Air Service, U.S. Army Air Corps, U.S. Army Air Forces, and the United States Air Force. Long career for General Doolittle. His rank upon retirement was Lieutenant General. He was later upgraded to 4-star General in an honorary ceremony. He commanded, after the Doolittle raid, 8th Air Force, 15th Air Force, and the 12th Air Force. He was awarded the Medal of Honor and 2 Distinguished Service Medals. And he received what is thought to be the first PhD in aeronautical engineering ever issued in the United States. So Jimmy Doolittle was not only a great pilot, he was a great flight leader, he was a great leader of large units like the 8th Air Force, and he was also an intellectual. So pretty accomplished man. Next is Lieutenant Tom Griffin. The Japanese had attacked us and we were mad. We wanted to hit them back. Figure Tom Griffin is a young 20-something gentleman. I think his philosophy, his motivation, his mindset was pretty common among the various members of the Doolittle raid and also the President of the United States as well as most of the American public. They wanted to hit back. You'll notice Lieutenant Tom Griffin over there on the far right side of the picture. The navigators are always on the far right. Lieutenant Griffin has a special place in my heart because I had the honor of having him speak in the early 1990s in Lexington, Kentucky. He was an engaging speaker, and I'm very proud to have had a chance to hear him talk. Tom Griffin was born July 10th, 1916 in Green Bay, Wisconsin. He served from 1939 to 1959. His rank upon retirement was Major. He served in the 34th and 438th Bomb Squadron. He was shot down over Sicily and held as a POW for 22 months, almost a year, or almost 2 years in captivity. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal 4 times. And finally, the main character of today's presentation, Lieutenant Charles Mac McClure. As soon as we heard Doolittle's name, we knew something. As soon as we heard Doolittle's name, we knew we could depend on real action. Something big was in prospect. And again, this was what all these men were thinking when they saw Colonel Doolittle walk into the room on their first briefing. They were like, wow, what are we going to be doing with this man? Mac McClure was born October 4th, 1916 in University City, Missouri. Years of service, 1940 to 1945. His rank upon retirement was captain. He served as a flight instructor at Mather Field after his service as a Doolittle Raider. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Purple Heart. He graduated from University City High School and the University of Missouri-Columbia with a degree in engineering. Here is Then Colonel Jimmy Doolittle with Captain of USS Hornet Mark Mitcher. Mark Mitcher would very soon after the Doolittle raid would be promoted to admiral. And you see all of these men were kind of gathered around ad hoc. These pictures that you saw of the flight crews, that was all very hastily pulled together because they had to launch early. And we'll talk about why in just a moment. Here is a picture from U.S. Air Force Museum, Wright-Patterson Field, outside of Dayton. This is Jimmy Doolittle on the right, wearing a very similar jacket to what you see sitting over there. On the left is Captain Mark Mitcher. Here's a photo of a B-25. One thing they had to keep sure of, though, is these are Army aircraft. They're not used to getting seawater drenched all over them. And these aircraft were too big to be put in the hangars down below deck on the aircraft carriers, so they had to strap them to the deck and just put tarps over the engines because Navy aircraft are used to salt water. Army Air Force's aircraft, no. So they had to do some field maintenance on the B-25s in order to keep them out of the sea. Another photo of the B-25, also from Air Force Museum. Here is Jimmy Doolittle taking off, first aircraft off the carrier. Now you'll notice this was a diagram drawn soon after the mission. And you notice you've got all of these radii, I think that's the plural of radius, all these radii of miles out. The raiders wanted to launch 500 miles out, but there was a problem. They ran across a Japanese fishing trawler that reported their position back to Tokyo. So they had a decision to make. Do they turn back from home? Because you've got two USS aircraft carriers. You've got Hornet, you've got Enterprise. You're 700 miles away from Japan. You are heavily outnumbered. So, do you turn for home? Or do you launch from 700 miles away from Japan and burn 200 miles more fuel to get to your landing sites in China? That's the problem. They decided to launch. All of the flight crews, with one possible exception, dropped their bombs on target in Japan. They bombed more than just Tokyo. They bombed other cities. They bombed strategic locations, factories, power plants in Tokyo. Mission is successful, at least in dropping your bombs. The problem now is, like we alluded to before, how do you get to your landing strips in China with 200 miles less fuel? Well, they did their best. As we know, one aircraft landed in the Soviet Union. Everyone else did the best they could to get to China. Nobody landed on a proper airstrip. In fact, the original plan was for the B-25s to land in airfields in China and turn their aircraft over to the American Volunteer Group, otherwise known as the Flying Tigers, led by Claire Chennault. And that would have been the Flying Tigers' first bombers. And Chennault was most unhappy that he couldn't get his bombers because he really wanted those. So what happened was the B-25s crashed in China. Or in Crew 7's situation, they crashed just off the coast of China. The pilot was a man named Ted Lawson. You may know the name Ted Lawson from 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, a book and a movie published very soon after the Doolittle raid. Well, Ted Lawson saw a nice big patch of beach, and he's thinking, all right, I will land on the beach. The beach will be hard enough, land, wheels down on the beach. So he's lining up to land on the nice, smooth beach. And then suddenly, engines go out of fuel. He got this far and couldn't bring it in. So the aircraft was known as the Ruptured Duck, which is ironic considering the crash that happened afterwards. But the Ruptured Duck crashed in the water just off the beach. Ted Lawson, co-pilot Dean Davenport, and navigator Mac McClure were catapulted through the windshield on impact. Bombardier Bob Cleaver was thrown through the B-25's glass nose. Engineer gunner Dave Thatcher was briefly knocked unconscious. His head wound was the least of Crew 7's injuries. It was amazing that these men managed to get from the water out of their sinking aircraft to the beach. They actually had to help each other because the injuries that they sustained were catastrophic. Ted Lawson sustained a compound fracture of his left leg, multiple facial lacerations, missing front teeth, and a lacerated left bicep. He was the worst injured of the crew. Dean Davenport suffered a fractured leg and a concussion. Mac McClure broke both of his shoulders and received multiple facial injuries. Bob Cleaver had deep cuts over his head and sprained his hips and his back. His eyes were also swollen shut. Dave Thatcher had a bruised head, back, and some cuts that later became infected. Dave Thatcher was the only enlisted man as the engineer gunner, so he basically became the doctor for these 4 horrifically injured officers. And you look at the memoirs of the other 4 members of Crew 7, they all admit, we gave Dave Thatcher a rough time. You know, we were kind of getting after him and ordering him around, and he wasn't sure, move me, deal with this wound. He was all over the place. I feel badly for the guy, but they all came to deeply respect Sergeant Thatcher for the work that he did to the best of his abilities, because other than a basic first aid kit that they salvaged from the Ruptured Duck, they had no medical equipment and they had no one with medical training to deal with these wounds. So Crew 7's Chinese adventure begins. Thankfully, Crew 7's crew found some Chinese villagers who were sympathetic to the nationalist cause. We have to remember, back in World War II, there were the nationalist Chinese who were supporting Chiang Kai-shek. Then there was the communist Chinese that supported Mao Zedong. And then there were Chinese that were sympathetic, let's say, to the Japanese. One crew was actually turned over to the Japanese by Chinese civilians. So fortunately, Crew 7 found sympathetic Chinese civilians. Unfortunately, the Chinese villagers could not speak English. And none of Crew 7 could speak Chinese, neither Cantonese nor Mandarin. So they had to use gestures. And remember, some of these guys are pretty beaten up. So gestures are a little difficult when you have two broken shoulders, as Mac McClure did. So they would use loud English to try to communicate with the Chinese. Also, all of the officers were unable to walk because of all their injuries. So the best that the Chinese could do was create these makeshift stretchers, which were basically hammocks. They strapped the men to these stretchers, and then they hand carried them throughout very rough, hilly, mountainous terrain. Now, Mac McClure talked about the absolute agony each step the Chinese took shifted him in his hammock. He's got two broken shoulders. So each shift, each step is a little knife of pain going into him. And this was miles that these very courageous Chinese civilians walked, because they had a good idea what the Japanese might do if they found out that they were assisting the Americans. Thatcher did what he could. He was able to walk at least, and was able to at least convey to the Chinese that we are American pilots. We're in need of significant medical attention. Please help us. Fortunately, after a long trek, many miles, many days, they reach a hospital in Linhai, China. By this time, a week later, 10 days later, infection starts setting in. And all of these injuries, these internal injuries, are not being set. Broken legs are not being set properly. Broken shoulders are not being set. So these men, even though they got to the hospital, are not out of danger yet. Thankfully, Doc White, a U.S. Army Air Force's flight surgeon who happened to be in Crew 15, was there. Now, Doc White's story is fascinating. He basically convinced Jimmy Doolittle that you're going to need a flight surgeon. You're on a dangerous mission. You don't know where you're going to land. You need somebody who knows medicine. And so Jimmy was like, all right, Doc, maybe I need a doctor, but I also need a gunner. So if you can replace one of my tail gunners by showing me that you know how to shoot a gun accurately, I'll let you fly on Crew 15. And Doc did. He became a proficient gunner with a 50 cal, and so he was on the mission. Ted Lawson owes Doc White his life because Lawson's left leg had become so badly infected that Doc had to amputate. And Doc even donated some of his own blood for a transfusion. Now, antibiotics were available at this hospital, but not in great quantities, because you never expect something like 4 men coming in, all with horrible injuries. You don't need that much antibiotic. You don't expect to need that kind of antibiotic. Well, they use the antibiotics up very quickly. And some of the guys who thought they were less seriously injured actually said, no, give the antibiotics over to my crewmates because they need it more than I do. So it just shows you the sacrifice these guys were willing to make. Here's a picture that Mac McClure considers the most important picture in his life, the one that he cherishes the most. That's Mac over here on the left. I don't know whether he's rolling his eyes or not, but they're wearing Chinese hats, and you see an example of all of the injuries these men sustained. Jimmy Doolittle had a better experience. His aircraft crash landed, but was actually in pretty good shape. Able to get out of China. He expected to be court-martialed. He thought the mission was a failure. So he's rather surprised to be awarded the Medal of Honor by President Roosevelt himself, and he's promoted 2 ranks from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general. He later served as the commander of the 8th, 12th, and 15th Air Forces. He ended the war as a 3-star general. He was an innovator. He changed Army fighter tactics so that fighters weren't stuck to the bombers. They could get out ahead, shoot down enemy aircraft, protect the bombers that way. Much better use of fighters. Every year, the Doolittle Raiders had a party. The first year, at least the first post-war party in Miami, got a little out of hand. So out of hand that it's reputed that Jimmy Doolittle was presented a bill of $10,000 from the hotel where the party was held, and one of the flyers asked him, "Hey, General, what are we going to do next year?" And Jimmy's reply was something along the lines of, "I can't afford next year." So they had a good time. General Doolittle passed away at age 96 on September 27th, 1993. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Here's a picture of Jimmy Doolittle with Chinese soldiers and civilians that heroically helped him get back to Allied lines. That's the remainder of the crew, of Crew 1. Jimmy Doolittle in North Africa. Here is the first anniversary of the Doolittle raid, also in North Africa, with all of the pilots that were serving in, I think it was called the 12th Air Force at the time. Jimmy was in charge of the 12th. So this was sort of the first anniversary, but not exactly the first party, because that happened post-war. Here is Major General Jimmy Doolittle. Tom Griffin. After bailing out near Yushan, China, Tom met up with his crew members. A group of 10,000 residents came to congratulate them, thank them, and tell them how much they appreciate them. Tom said he had never seen that kind of party before, of people just descending upon the town. Tom appreciated his Army dress uniform so much that he kept it for the rest of his life. He actually took it out of the crashed B-25 and kept it because he valued it so much. He resumed his Army Air Forces career, flew as a navigator on B-26 bombers in North Africa and the Mediterranean. He was shot down over Sicily July 4th, 1943, and spent the rest of the war in a German prisoner of war camp. Major Tom Griffin passed away on February 26th, 2013. He was 96. I mentioned earlier that I had the honor of hearing Tom speak, and while I was there, I was fortunate enough to get a print of a B-25 that I have over here that Tom signed, and it hangs on my wall in my office at home. Here's Tom Griffin's A2. So not only did he keep his Army dress uniform, he kept his A2 flight jacket. Very cool. This is from the Air Force Museum. You have a chance, definitely go see it. Here is a picture, April of 2012, shows the surviving Doolittle Raiders. Tom Griffin is over there on the left side. Dave Thatcher, you'll remember him from Crew 7, is second from the left. Mac McClure. After his evacuation from China, Mac was hospitalized at Walter Reed Army Hospital in Washington, D.C. until June of 1943. You may have noticed that Mac was not wearing his A2 flight jacket in the picture that we saw. You'll remember he was thrown through the windshield of the B-25, so basically his A2 was cut to pieces. During his convalescence, he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, as all of the Doolittle Raiders were, with the exception of Jimmy himself, who received the Medal of Honor. Mac published his Doolittle account in the 10-part series, How We Bombed Japan. This was my primary material for a lot of what I'm talking to you about today. I was able to find each volume in the series from the St. Louis County Library's databases. We have an amazing collection of archived newspapers, databases, genealogical material that you have access to free of charge. So I also invite you to come out to the St. Louis County Library. Who knows, you might even see me there. Mac retired from the Army Air Force for disability in June of 1945. Mac's injuries were enormous. 2 broken shoulders that weren't set properly soon after they were broken. And so Mac was not able to return to flight status. He served as an instructor for Army Air Force's navigators throughout the end of the war, but he ended up retiring disabled in June of 45. He worked as a salesman for the Appleton Wire Works in Wisconsin. He passed away January 19th, 1999, Tucson, Arizona. He was 83 years of age. He was survived by his wife, Edith, and 2 daughters. Here is Mac receiving his Distinguished Flying Cross. You also notice 2 other members of Flight 7, Harold Watson and Ted Lawson. Lawson is there in the middle right there. You also notice Jimmy Doolittle standing above the Flyers. Here's another angle of the same photo. Lawson receiving his award. Mac McClure on the left side. Here is one of the examples that I use to create my own reproduction of Mac McClure's A2 flight jacket with the extra pocket. I've got it sitting over there. I've also got a reproduction of Jimmy Doolittle's A2 flight jacket. I just love the way that these airmen realized, okay, my A2 flight jacket doesn't have enough pockets, so I'm going to make my own. Question, sir?
What unit does the patch represent?
This is the 95th Bombardment Squadron. Thank you for the question. Here's Jimmy Doolittle and Mac McClure with a B-25. And that's all I've got for you today. I'd like to thank all of you for coming out today. I also want to invite you to come out to the St. Louis County Library, view all the resources that we have. Also want to let you know about my next program, which I'll be doing with my good friend and colleague, CJ Hall. We're going to be doing this in February of 2024. It's going to be St. Louis's role in the Tuskegee Airmen.